Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today will be an unusual program, I think. My guest is Dr. Bruce Damer, who is a polymath, to put it mildly. He has a company that is contracted with NASA for many years to develop virtual reality simulations of space flights. In fact, he has designed some rockets for actually creating sustainable communities in outer space. He is also the archivist for counterculture figures such as Timothy Leary and Terence McKenna. He maintains a museum in his barn in Boulder Creek, California, of the history of computing, including a Cray supercomputer there in the barn. He is also co-author with Dr. David Demer, my old friend, of a theory on the origins of life that was featured on the cover of Scientific American magazine. So he's a man of many accomplishments. Now, last time, for those of you who are regular viewers, you'll know that this will be our fourth interview. The third one that we had, I had planned to talk to him about our destiny of humanity in outer space migration, and his work in that area. But he was very moved to talk about some of his personal experiences and even to respond to comments that have been posted on YouTube in the comments section to his previous interviews. So I think tonight will be an opportunity for us to cover many topics, including his own personal journey and his interest in the destiny of humankind in outer space. And now I'll switch over to the internet video. I thought maybe a good place to start would be with your work with NASA doing simulations of space flights.
I, like you, probably, where were you in July 20th, 1969, Jeffrey?
July 20th. I don't know. It's not a date that sticks in my mind.
The date that Neil Armstrong stepped out on the moon.
See, in my mind, I am so careless. I thought it was 1968.
Yeah, I was with the family at our lake cottage, and we had a little black and white TV. We didn't have TV at home. I think they borrowed a black and white TV, and there was a huge summer thunderstorm going on. This was in the Shuswap Lakes in British Columbia, and the lightning would hit the lake. It didn't hit the cabin, so the TV kept broadcasting. And I just remember I was so obsessed with this. You know, months before I'd studied the launch of Apollo 9 with Rusty Schweikart aboard, who I later worked with. I think I mentioned that in our first interview. But here I was finally, I'd taken the garbage cans out the previous week, and that's when Michael Collins and the crew were orbiting the moon, and I tried to see it. And then actually after the landing, after seeing that fuzzy picture of Neil coming down and the ladder and stuff, actually I was studying the moon from our house in Kamloops, British Columbia, seeing if I could see a little dot there. And later I read that Michael Collins, who was the command module commander, had a high-powered scope trying to see if he could find them. And I think it was difficult for him to find them just through this naked eye kind of thing.
Even from the command module.
Recently, we've seen wonderful pictures of Apollo 11's landing site with Neil's steps. As Neil took a break, I don't know how they had a break. I think they only had 14 hours on the surface. And he walked over to West Crater, which is the hazard that they'd avoided coming on the final descent and landing. And he just wanted to see it. He wanted to see the thing that they almost could have tipped into. And met their end. So he walked to the crater and he walked back just to look over. And those personal moments are so important. So his contact with being there, you know. So that's where I caught the space bug. But then around 1972 or 73, our town was kind of behind the times, so we got movies a little later than the rest of the world. But and the hippies arrived in our town like in the early to mid 70s when they were all cleared out. They were cleared out of the Haight-Ashbury by then, but they came to Canada. But I remember seeing Arthur C. Clarke. He wrote 2001: A Space Odyssey, and it was, of course, produced by Stanley Kubrick. And after the apes get through throwing their bones in the air and things, there's this wonderful scene of the Pan Am shuttle, now extinct airline called Pan Am, coming up to the rotating station. This beautiful station that's supposed to be in 2001, and it's partially under construction. You can see trusses and beams and things, and then there's a central core, and the shuttle rotates and it goes into the station and couples, and there's like hundreds of people there, and there's a Hilton Hotel in part of it. And
the Blue Danube Waltz is playing.
Now, my little sciencey, spacey, geeky brain is not waltzing to the Blue Danube. My brain is doing computations on the shuttle size, and that I saw there was probably a payload, a cargo version of that shuttle. How do they get those parts up there to build that thing? But the cargo version of the shuttle would not be long enough for the trusses. That I was computing that there were 980 trusses in the thing. And then there was these base block sections that had to be in the circular central part. And I thought, okay, the only way this station is built is by heavy booster lifting like the Saturn V, but with a big fairing. This is a total space geek kid. And I said, there's almost 1,000 launches to lift these parts. No one would pay for that. It would have an impact on the atmosphere. And that's when I started to sort of think, what? Come on, you can give us these great visions. Chesley Bonestell and Wernher von Braun gave us the vision in Collier's magazine of the donut space station. You can come up with these visions, but they're not practical. We can't lift that stuff. And so around 1974, I started thinking about it seriously. And by 1977, 78, I was doing hundreds of drawings. I found these recently, actually, in the last few years, of asteroid mining, asteroid redirect, using shock pellet kinds of things. And I wrote letters to NASA with my designs, and I wrote letters to Gerard O'Neill at Princeton, who had he was the father, and you might have even interviewed him.
I haven't, but I know about his work and the idea of, I think he called it the L5 point, where we could establish a
so Gerard
space
O'Neill
station.
Was extraordinary. He was a physicist sort of in the mold of Carl Sagan, but from Princeton, and he somehow got the bug too, and he established, participated or led a summer school at NASA Ames Research Center in 1975. And then this, if you can see, I don't know if you can see the Latin NASA
I can
logo.
see it.
Am I seeing it? So that's Ames Research Center, my main NASA center that I've done so much work with. So in the summer of 75, there was this wonderful program called the Summer Study Program on, I think, space habitats. And it resulted in the High Frontiers book and another set of paintings, not by Chesley Bonestell, but another artist showing Bernal's sphere, or almost like Dyson sphere, space stations in a long colony with a sort of clear glass thing. And of course, inside are 70s suburbs, with Frank Lloyd Wright type houses and playgrounds. And it's like Silicon Valley 70s suburbs, which is not really a practical vision for building $1 trillion space habitat. You wouldn't just put, like Burger King and Del Taco, and, you wouldn't do that. But it was a beautiful vision. It was the first time since von Braun and Bonestell that this was actually taken up engineering-wise. And so I got all excited about that, and I wrote to Gerard O'Neill in '79, and I joined the Space Studies Institute, which literally was building rail guns at Princeton, where basically what do they call them? Linear induction motors that can fire a little bucket or a pellet at very, very high speed by flipping magnets. It's the basis behind magnetic levitation trains. And what they want to do is attach one of these things to an asteroid and chew up parts of it and throw it out the end as like a little pea shooter and create a reaction mass and drive the asteroids to a place where you could mine them, for example. So I was sending ideas and drawings to the Space Studies Institute in '78, '79. So anyway, that's just my early geeking out for space. I think in a sense you have to start young if you want to get anywhere.
Well, you founded a company that contracted with NASA to do virtual reality simulations of various missions.
This is another deep digression, but in 1969 I get my first bicycle, and I'm riding it through the slush, and I go down to the neighbors who have a color television. And by color TV, it has like 3 colors. So it's like super washed out. But on this TV is the Apollo 9 launch. And I remember Walter Cronkite showing the pictures of the 3 astronauts, and one of them had really red hair. And his name was Rusty something or other. And I thought, well, that's a cool guy. I always remember him. And then turns out I'm at this conference in 1999, and there he is. Now, his red hair is now white, but he was on Apollo 9, and he wrote, just like Edgar Mitchell, this beautiful, beautiful piece about the sort of overview effect of seeing the Earth. And Apollo 9 tested all the Apollo landing stuff in Earth orbit, like the LEM, and Rusty did an extensive spacewalk and got space sick. He was the first person to be medically characterized getting space sickness, and I think those patches were developed because of Rusty's experience, those space and air sickness patches. Rusty he got so sick that he had to call off his spacewalk at one point. So, but I met him in 1999, and he said, "Hey, what do you do?" And I told him virtual worlds and simulations and avatars, and I said, "Hey, why don't we do something for the Apollo 11 30th anniversary? Why don't we go into this virtual world that's a set of the Apollo landing, which had been built by art students at the University of Cincinnati. You can come in and be in any avatar you want." He chose an Apollo moon suit avatar, and you can walk people through it. So he literally did this. They were the first crew to ride on the Saturn V, and he talked about the stage separation and the violence of the kick when the second stage. It was a real historic figure in an avatar space in active worlds. It looks sort of clunky, and it's all text chat, but it's 3D, and the graphics were pretty good for '99. And it was similar to the time when Terrence McKenna and I did the same thing, but the world that we were in was not a space world, but a sort of trippy world. But that's a whole other topic, a whole other podcast. But then,
so you were already pretty deeply involved with virtual reality at that point.
I was one of the pioneers in a sense that, like Barack Obama, I was the community organizer for it. So I held the first conference in 1996 called Earth to Avatars, and here comes your little graphic up here, Earth to Avatars. I wrote the first book on it called Avatars that came out in '97. And I organized the community so that everyone would intermix, and the platforms that were being built, which later became things like Second Life and Minecraft, grew out of that. The platforms would be rich. And we did all of the major experiments. We did the virtual walk on the moon with Rusty Schweikart, which was a phenomenal experience of presence. People were mesmerized. They were going into the LEM, the lunar module, under Rusty's direction and backing their avatars out and sliding down the virtual ladder. And we realized there's a power in these virtual environments for all kinds of things, but for experiential learning. Now, what this did was I showed this at a NASA Virtual Worlds conference in September '99, And in the front row was Bill Clancy, one of the chief scientists at NASA Ames. Here's Ames again. And they started funding us. So by 2000, I'd won several awards. I'd won SBIRs. By 2001, we had multiple awards from NASA and other sort of space companies.
And I'm assuming that at this point now you're developing virtual reality models of future missions.
Literally, this gave this little nerdy kid the opportunity to, in my head, which I'd been sort of traveling the solar system since I was 9 or 10, we model everything. So every American mission, space station construction, shuttle Hubble servicing mission, incredible detail for training and for public outreach. Then I started doing designs. So civil servants would come from a different NASA center and say, hey, how do we build a lunar base with just robotics? Just teleoperated robotics. And so I came up with one of the first comprehensive designs, all using lucid dreaming, by the way, because I packed my head full of ideas for about 6 months of all kinds of telerobotic things. And then one morning I woke up and it was like this vivid lucid dream as I was waking up. It was the entire rack assembly with robots leaving and going down to the surface one after the other. And I drew it. I reached over to a pad and I drew it out, and it became a reference study for Raytheon for NASA, for headquarters. And it was shown at conferences and things like this. And I was in a documentary about the power of human dreams, actually, about a year later. This is about 2006 or something. So all that was rolling. And then one day, another crew arrived that said, Bruce, we're civil servants. We don't have imagination because we're civil servants, and we don't take risks, so we don't use our imagination. And we just don't do that, but you do. You're not a civil servant. Will you figure out how to send a human crew to an asteroid? How to send a human crew. And at that point, NASA was headed back to the moon, which I think is actually a silly idea, but that's another topic. The Bush 2 was wanting to go back to the moon. And this is happening to NASA now again, where a silly White House pronouncement has them heading back to the moon without really thinking why. But then there's all this push, and then it gets canceled. This is about the third time. This is happening the third or fourth time. I was just at a conference in Colorado where there's all these excitement about there's companies going to make little landers that land on the moon, and there's money allocated. And our incredibly informed vice president is saying we need to land on the moon by 2024, and it's like, how informed is that? How crazy is that? It's with. Anyway, it just makes no sense, but that'll all change. But anyway, so NASA was headed to the moon again in 2007. And so we did an alternative. We showed how to take that same hardware, the same new Constellation Orion capsule, and instead send it to an asteroid, dock it with the asteroid with tether downs with a little module attached to the end. And I did all this design on paper for a group from NASA's Johnson Space Center, and go down tethers. Once you get attached, because asteroids have low gravity, even one that's 500 meters, and it's like an insect. Insects have to keep from flying. They have hooks on their legs, so they keep from getting pulled off by wind. So we did that with my brother's rock piton tether system that he told me how to do, and it was a viable design. And so I did the design, and then the civil servant said, well, it's too controversial for us to put it out there because we're supposed to be going to the moon, but the administrator wanted to find out if this same hardware could go to another target, a fresh target. Asteroids were made out of them. They're a threat to us, but they're also the source of the organics that probably started life on Earth. So they're really interesting, and there are future resource stepping stones. And so I did it. I did this whole design, and they said, well, we can't release it, but you can. You're not a civil servant. You can't get fired. And this is from Pete Warden, our 2-star general running, NASA Ames. So I did. So I lined up all the media. I lined up the public affairs office, internal NASA scientists, everyone in the know, that we were going to release a story about going to a new place in the solar system. But it was just me doing it. With my designs, we did it at Industrial Light and Magic in San Francisco, in front of a room full of animators and standing next to Darth Vader in a glass case, and then a big public thing. It was just a design. It wasn't NASA's official thing, but the media picked up on it. It was on the cover of Popular Science. It was all over the internet as NASA's new target. And what we were doing was using this push to redirect the agency, and it worked. So suddenly it was NASA's new target, and we knew that there wasn't a brain running NASA. It's just a big bureaucracy. So all of the contractors jumped on it as asteroids are cool now. No one knew where this came from. So NASA steered, when Obama came in, from the moon toward asteroids. So we got the OSIRIS-REx mission. We got all this interest. It's been huge. So that's one of the things that you can do with design.
And your company has been involved in, I gather, many iterations of this notion of what can we do with asteroids.
What we also did for the same Rusty Schweikart, as on Apollo 9 and the virtual, walk on the moon guy, he founded an organization called the B612. And I think it's from the Little Prince, who studied asteroids or jumped from one to the other, the Petit Prince. So B612, its whole mission was focus on asteroids as threats to our civilization. And we did the gravity tractoring solution. We took their data from JPL and showed how you could have a little kinetic impactor that would make a change, and you could have a spacecraft just orbiting alongside an asteroid. It would pull its orbit slightly, just ever so slightly, so it would miss the Earth over several years. That's a gentle, way of doing it. So all of that settled into a whole new thing that I thought I was done. By 2012, our funding had dried up, and I was going into pure science. I was going into the origin of life. That was another passion. I said, it's time to actually work. I'd met David Deemer, who you know very well, at UC Santa Cruz, and we were really working on our new hot spring hypothesis. And the breakthrough came at the end of 2013. But the space sort of thing was sort of on the back burner. But then suddenly, I just got a bee in my bonnet that I was going to go back to work on the asteroid problem. How do we get resources from asteroids? And I had no funding, but I still had Ryan Norkus on the team, our fantastic illustrator animator in Australia. I said, Ryan, we're just going to do a few things. I have this idea of a bag or a balloon that we have to get it around an asteroid or a kind of comet head that has stuff coming off, gas coming off. Because I had been with my friend Brad Blair at NASA's Ames Research Center. Ames, there it is again. We were standing there in the middle of the night in 2013, and there was a flashing light on the top of Hangar 1, which is one of the largest airship hangars in the world. The thing that actually started Silicon Valley was really the airship moving there in the 30s, and Navy's airship operations. So it's flashing. And I said, Brad, you're big on mining the moon, but what if this flashing light was a comet that got caught in the Earth-Moon system, and it was just orbiting the Earth and Moon, and it was burning off? The tail was going this way, and then it would go this way, and the volatiles of the ice was burning off, like what happens to comets. What would you think of that? Rather than the difficulties of going to the moon, finding a dark, shadowed crater, and mining this dust to try to find any semblance of water, because you need water in space. So Brad said, if that happened, every spacefaring nation would be trying to lay claim to that, because you'd have 100,000 tons of water ice and CO2 and everything to make a huge fueling station and to provide water for radiation, for drinking, for cooling. it would change the economics of space. There'd be a gigantic filling station in orbit. And I said, well, what would they do? He said they try to enclose it somehow in a fabric enclosure and manage the temperature and then capture those things coming off, those gases. And I said, well, why don't we learn how to go and do that then? If that's actually the easiest way to open the solar system, let's just go do that. Rather than exporting digging machines and conveyor belts and half of Earth's civilization, industrial base, to the moon to do a simple thing of extracting water when it's flying through the solar system and coming in meteor showers every year. When you see the tails of comets burning up, and it still falls on the Earth by the millions of tons, and it probably gave us part of our water. Certainly our organics that are in our bodies are made out of those things. And so then I started working on it, and I started to create fabric bags. And you can actually see some of the pictures behind me there are the original drawings from Shepard, which are online, or I can put them online. Now, I was doing that. Ryan was making sort of wireframing diagrams of this, and we were at the Contact Conference, Jim Fanero's Contact Conference in 2014. And I was standing outside the Domain Hotel, and there's this skinny guy standing there with no badge, and he was a replacement speaker. And I said to him, hey, for some reason I was looking at Ryan's animations on my phone, and I said, would you like to see our asteroid capture solution? And I showed this to this man, and he looked at it, and he said, it'll never work. I said, I said, well, who are you? And he said, I'm Peter Janiskins, and I'm an asteroid astronomer at the SETI Institute. My job is, if there's a fireball in the sky, my phone rings and we go pick up the pieces, or we try to track meteorites and asteroids as they enter the atmosphere. And he knew everything there was to know about asteroids. I thought, I'm busted. My idea is falsified. And so he said, don't worry about it. Let's go to lunch. So we went out to the fish restaurant and had a bowl of clam chowder. At the end of the bowl of clam chowder, he looked up and said, I figure out how to make it work. I figured it out. So as we were walking back to the conference, he said, we bring the gas to the asteroid. We don't go and enclose it and wait for gases to come off, because it's just going to be too difficult. But if we bring the gas up there like a tank full of helium, we can put in the balloon enclosure. It's now the asteroid's inside the enclosure. There's great video you can feature. And you don't touch it. You don't have a gantry, or you don't have a mitt grabbing it, because it's a consolidated rubble pile with parts that will come off and destroy your enclosure and your spacecraft. You can't touch these things. You have to handle them very, very gently. So because it's in a gas-filled balloon, it has friction with the gas and will gradually slow with the friction and stop. And then we can use jets of gas from the same ductwork to rotate it like a sailing ship into the breeze that we're pushing across it at less than a Newton of force. And then we can drive it. We can push that breeze on it like a sailing ship for space. And as it starts to move, it's called delta V in the space geeky industry, it starts to change its orbit. We then fire a solar propulsion system out the back to make sure we don't come into contact. As it's on the move, we have to keep the balloon centered around it. And we could move these things all over the solar system. We could harvest volatiles on the way. We could be sucking out the juices, even taking gas and pulling out nickel and iron and making parts in space using the Mond carbonyl gas process in vacuum to electroform parts. And that would solve the problem of the Kubrick space station, to be able to make giant trusses and beams from carbonyl gas extraction and pop them off, open the enclosure, let the asteroid go, pop off the part, then re-encapsulate the asteroid and continue gas mining. And then the third variant, which is my favorite, is if you have something that's a bunch of water ice and a bunch of rock and carbonaceous material, you melt it carefully with the controlling gas until it becomes a globule. like one of those glass spheres that has life in it, that all it needs is sunlight. There's shrimp in there, and it could be sealed for 100 years. That globule of water, you would introduce life. You have algae and whole ecosystem, even fishes or shrimps or something, and that would be a biosphere. And the biosphere, and I said this to Dorian Sagan, Carl Sagan's son. You may have interviewed Carl. No. So Carl and Jerry O'Neill, I guess, were the great space guys of the 80s. But this idea of biospheres, we can make them that easily and then harvest for them. So yes, after all this, we can make Kubrick's space station in parts. We can feed crew, and we can create a sustainable pearl of gas stations and mining outposts and food production throughout the solar system if we want to as a species. And we can actually spread not only human civilization through this one invention, but we can also allow Gaia, if you will, call Gaia, the ability to finally reproduce, because the Earth is running out of steam. You know, as James Lovelock wrote about in his last book, the sun's on this heating curve, and we're going to run out of the ability for complex life to be on land within 100 to 200 million years because of the stars and main sequences getting hotter. And so the atmosphere, if it has any CO2 in it at all, we run away to greenhouse runaway. We become Venus. So actually, there's a Terminator line that gobbled up Venus early on and evaporated its oceans to the atmosphere, creating a 90 bar CO2 atmosphere. That Terminator line is getting close to the Earth. And once we cross over that, we flip to Venus conditions, just as Mars died because it went outside a habitable zone. And that Lovelock's claim is we're really close to that, and that humans are the last shot. We're this massively complex, beautiful eruption of evolution, but we're it. There's nothing coming. There's not arachnids driving cars with 8 stick shifts coming in the future, because we'll have used up the gasoline. But I'm sounding more like Seth Shostak here. But this is it. I mean, humans are what the Earth really was for, you know, apart from the evolution thing, but we're like the great and glorious expression of the power of 4 billion years of evolution. And it's our bequeath. It's our mission to take complex life forward. It's our responsibility, and it's our great mission. It gives humanity an actual mission, you know, for once. You know, it's not just eating hamburgers and paying mortgages and complaining all day. We actually have a mission, which is to preserve and project forward this precious, complex life that we are into the cosmos.
You're saying we've got to do it within the next 100 million.
We probably have to do
so.
it in the next 100, because we're stressing the environment such that we reach a breaking point, and we haven't seen the beginnings of this yet. Of real climate change disaster hasn't started yet. We're not feeling the pain. We can still order stuff from Amazon and it comes, and there aren't empty grocery stores and huge riots and refugee populations by their billions. That has not started. So we're in this halcyonic period where there's some panic about things or whatever. We haven't seen the first. I thought we'd see them earlier, but maybe a little in the 2020s. We have like a runway still. We have time. But when the hockey stick of methane release from the permafrost happens, if that happens sometime in the century, we're going to flip into, you know, basically Blade Runner 2049. And then all bets are off, because you're now in an enclave system. You can pick any 3 islands you want to make out of Florida. But cities become city-states. They become, you know, this is one model. They become connected by air transport and energy systems, but in between there's just a mess. You know, that could be one model, the enclave system. But it's not very pleasant. And when that happens, it's all about, you know, it's like when Rome fell. When the Western Rome fell, and it kept getting sacked by these tribes basically from the Paleolithic, there was no security, and so all the institutions in the West were lost. I mean, the libraries and the theater and the polity, and it was all lost. And so Eastern Rome was preserved, and there were parts of the Roman provinces that kept going under their own governance. But it was a huge loss for hundreds of years of all that. And we really don't want to go through that. So if at all we can bridge over, and this is an initiative I'm going to start in the next month here, to try to network a bunch of people together to bridge us over. That's a whole other topic.
Maybe you better explain. I don't know exactly what you meant by that phrase, to bridge us over.
The only way to get things done, in this world, we have environmental groups that raise the alarm, and they try to work the political angle, but that's not how things get done in the world, right? Because politics is so malleable and personally involved, and politicians don't have a lot of power to affect things. Where things get done in the world is finance connected to infrastructure builds and property. That's how the world turns. People think that presidents and whatnot are actually able to do stuff, but they really do very little. So here's the strategy, and I'm calling this thing a climate mitigation initiative, because climate amelioration suggests that we can somehow do a massive scale process of either sequestering CO2 or reducing greenhouse emissions. But there isn't any real indication that there's a political will to do this. And humans keep getting born, and every baby that's born is going to use 1,000 times the energy that when we were born. They're going to want mobile phones and AR headsets and whatever they're going to want. They're going to want lots of material and travel in their lives, and there's more and more of them. So it doesn't really matter what we do. These are recycling and stuff are very minor, have very minor amelioration effects. So what we actually have to do is look forward about a mitigation, which means these changes are going to come, and we have to build bridging technologies to overcome them. One example of a serious challenge is heading into California in the 30s and 40s, which is the hurricanes that start in the Gulf of Mexico and down in Baja are getting more and more powerful. This was worked out by my friend Dave Muffley, who was Apple's arborist, who laid out the oak forest at the new Apple Park. He and Steve realized we've got to plant Tucson and Mexican oak trees in Cupertino to weather climate change. So they planted 6,000 of them. They grew them, he grew them, and it's the most fantastic project, in terms of active forest migration. And Dave explained to me last year that he said, look, those hurricanes that usually break in Arizona and they dump a ton of rain on Arizona, there's all these washouts. They're powerful, getting more powerful. They're going to push through to Los Angeles. So September, August, whatever, hurricanes are coming through the Southland, powering up the coast of California. They're going to turn, they're going to pick up more energy on the Pacific. They're going to go through the Central Valley, dumping 10-inch tropical rainfalls on the Central Valley in August. And if you talk to any farmer, orchardist in the Central Valley and say, what if this happened to you? They'd say, we're done. Our crops are done. Our trees are destroyed. It's a disaster for what we're trying to do. And it turns out that Dave worked out that it would also kill 100% of the California native oaks, because this infusion of this type of rainfall would cause fungus to emerge over several years and wipe out the oak forest, just as the bark beetle killed all the trees in Kamloops, BC, and in British Columbia, all the way down to Arizona. Now all the pine bark beetle infestation. So you lose 100%. So you lose California agriculture, or it's under huge stress. You have to invest tens of billions of dollars to prepare for this. And a good example from the creative minds was Blade Runner 2049, a film that came out, I think, last year, made by Weta Workshop. And next time I'm down at Weta, I'm going to actually say, you guys nailed it. The first scene in Blade Runner 2049 is the cop is landing his floating cop car where? In the Central Valley at a hydroponics farm where some guy's raising weird, huge squid or something, and it lands next to a dead oak tree, just all dead and white. He said, that you nailed it. You nailed it for in this model. So mitigation means really looking forward and saying, we need to invest now. We need to build seawalls. We need to protect refinery complexes from saltwater infusion. We need to roll through agriculture. We need to do all this stuff. We need to start. The 20s needs to be the decade of design, and the 30s we must be building all over the world to mitigate. So that's
in order, it sounds like what you're saying, in order to buy enough time for the human civilization to develop the infrastructure and the hardware required to migrate to outer space.
Anything, actually, in a sense that we will stop thinking about space migration or the origin of life or many other visionary things if we're under this kind of threat, the kind of threat that Western Rome found and the whole Roman Empire felt itself under. We will just have no capacity to do things. I mean, we'll lose the capacity for art and theater and hope altogether. We'll just be in a defensive position, as the monasteries of the Dark Ages found themselves in, like the.
If I hear you correctly, Bruce, you're saying the best we can do is ameliorate the problem. We're eventually it's going to overtake us.
It's going to overtake us. We're sort of guaranteed to have these issues. So we're really good tool makers. Off the plains of Africa, we managed to survive the desiccation of East Africa when the Rift Valley broke, and the complete desertification of East Africa when supposedly the modern line of hominids ended up in South Africa and modern humans sort of emerged. The signs in the Blombos caves, for example, that show modern people at 130 or 180,000 years ago. From this neck down, genetic neck down, we're incredibly versatile and adaptive. So we just flip into that mode. So instead of denying things or having the hope that we can somehow ameliorate and delay, we need to look this thing right down the barrel of what this thing is that's coming, do our projections, and start to build and start to prepare. So I met a U.S. Navy Admiral, Norman Hayes, in Qatar in January, and he and I came up with this thing. We were standing at the Museum of Muslim Art, which is a fantastic new museum, and there's like a $300-400 billion city that's been built across the bay. Qatar's been this huge building boom, preparing for the FIFA World Cup. They have really intelligent people in the royal family. Her Highness, who established the Qatar Foundation, and has got all these universities there, and it's really quite an amazing place. But they had a 1-inch rainfall in December, so a month before we were there, and there was no understreet drainage built in the whole country. They've never had a 1-inch rainfall in the Gulf, and it flooded the entire country. And Her Royal Highness said, we screwed up. We did not prepare for climate change, and we don't have a single thing done to ameliorate sea level rise. We're at sea level. We're effectively an island. And we're building 7 stadiums now for FIFA World Cup and a subway, which is going to be inundated. What were we thinking? And Norman and I looked across at the cityscape and realized that's going to be rusty scaffolding in 40 or 50 years. We've got to do something. And this is an admiral who had served in the Iraq, the wasteful and completely unnecessary Iraq and Afghanistan operations, where the U.S. blew $2 trillion for nothing, and all these lives lost, ridiculous wastage when the U.S. could have been energy independent in 15 years with that same expense. It's one of the great crimes of our time that we allow our governments to be profligate and put ourselves into debt and to create such an animosity around the world when so-called greatest country on earth blows it multiple times and the public just sits there. It's like, as we blow it again, and we blow our futures. But this is a man, Norman Hayes, who deeply cares about the country and the future. And he said, we've got to do something. And his idea was, we need a national convention to get the grassroots groups together, to get the Department of Defense in, Army Corps of Engineers, Skidmore, Owings, Merrill, engineering firms, everybody at the table, and we'll do it in New Orleans. We'll do a convention in New Orleans because it's a city that's lost, a city that will no longer be there in 40 or 50 years. You can't do anything about that. So, and we'll force the federal government to pay attention and stand up a new federal agency to deal with this. And we'll do this the way that we would, coming out of the Department of Defense, whose mission is to defend America against threats. Now, if the sea is rising all across the country, we need to have different walls than walls with Mexico. And we all worked it out. It was like half an hour. We said, wait a minute, we're going to have to merge the economy of Mexico and the U.S. into a single unit because we're going to need 40 million skilled concrete workers. You get them from Central America. Those are the guys have the incredible skill sets that will be needed to build $1 trillion sea level mitigation system and agricultural mitigation and everything much bigger than the Apollo project or the Marshall Plan. And he just had this incredible passion for it. So we started having weekly calls. And about a month ago, I woke up in bed at night like, Climate Mitigation Associates. We'll set up an initial step as a network of several hundred people who have a passion but have also deep skill sets about this issue, about how to build and prepare for these changes. And then the CMA, I call it. So I got climatemitigation.net, and it's now waiting to find help. Maybe someone listening to New Thinking Aloud will say, hey, I'll build the site.
Well, let me ask you this question, Bruce. I'm a little confused because earlier you said you cannot count on governments to do this. Politicians have really no power and there's no political will. It has to come from the infrastructure, the industrial center, and the financial center. But then you said, no, we've got to get the government involved. So how do you envision it?
Things get done in America through vested self-interest. Let's face it. That's how the pivot works. It's rare that public interest is represented. It's usually companies or special groups that make laws and stuff like that. So here's what happened. So last year, I think it was a combination of Facebook and Google, who had just built $10 billion in campuses in Silicon Valley, but they're basically in the shoreline area marshlands right. Some of it's on NASA Ames. They're at sea level. So they built these billions of dollars of campuses. And somebody from one of the companies approached the county of San Mateo and said, we're under threat. In 40 years or so, there's going to be storm surges coming through our campuses. What are you guys doing about this? Because we need some kind of Dutch-style seawall abatement system, but we still need to let water through into the marshlands so that the bay doesn't have any lungs. And we know this is complicated. Are you doing anything? And the county of San Mateo says, we're not. We're a poor county. We don't have resources. So I think it was Google that said, we have billions of dollars. We will fund the studies. Let's at least start studying this thing. So the Bay Area Planning Group got involved. There was actually something on the ballot last time for the Bay Area seawall. So I explained this to Norman Hayes, and he said, that's all good. And that shows that there's companies interested, individuals interested, academics interested, but that's a local thing. We need a national thing. We can't have just individual cities doing their own thing. We need to coordinate this thing. And he's a long-range planner. His career at the Pentagon was deeply involved in long-range planning. And I'm a long-range planning junkie as well as an archives history junkie. So he said, we need to coordinate all this into one thing. And so what seems to be out there, I'll give another example, Chevron in Houston. Like there's the Houston Ship Canal. There's Chevron. All the largest refinery complexes in the United States are sort of in that coast. They had salt water come into their complexes during the hurricanes. This is not good. It just destroys equipment. I mean, the seawater that went down the subway in New York, I think from Sandy, destroyed that subway line for a year. It wiped it out. So you don't need a lot of sea level rise before you get major damage. So Chevron and the other refiners are like, this is serious. We need to be investing in infrastructure to protect all this. It's the energy source for the United States, whether you like it or not. If you're going to lose that capacity, we need to work. So then the idea is to go to finance, to big finance, and say, what is the percentage of your portfolios that are at risk to climate change? We will do the studies. The CMA, the Climate Mitigation Associates, will do the studies and tell you where your risk is and what decade it is. Because if you don't know, you guys are risk oriented. And then out of that study will come a fund, the climate mitigation fund itself, where all these organizations can pile in, whether they be cities or Google or huge financial organizations or engineering firms, and there's an investment opportunity here. So then hundreds of billions of dollars pour in to different parts of the mitigation investment field that will start doing the build outs, the design in the 20s and the builds in the 30s. It becomes, so finance then turns and pays attention and starts investing, and all these people jump on board. It doesn't matter what politicians say or naysayers. It's over with. They're either at the table or they're not at the table. And because the industry's moving, individual property owners are moving, finance is moving, infrastructure is moving to prepare so that you don't lose all that. And you can just safely ignore all the noise.
Well, we started by talking about space migration and harvesting of asteroids. But what you're saying is we have a more urgent problem before we can really address the kind of infrastructure required to take more than a few people into outer space. We've got to make the Earth a bit more habitable.
Yeah, and in a sense, this is why just a few months ago I woke up again in the middle of the night seeing all the dreamy projects I have about expanding the biosphere and figuring out how life began and the philosophical impacts of that. And even the current work I'm doing with Luminous, which is all about the inner healing, all of that will not progress if we're under a state of siege by these changes. So with the years that I have left and the energy I have left, I should do something. And I was given this opportunity to meet Admiral Norman Hayes, and he's the first black admiral in the U.S. Navy. He's retired. He's an amazing fellow. He worked for Jim Stavridis, who was a 4-star admiral. Really, these are great people. These are people who truly care about the Earth and humanity, and they see all the foibles and the problems, but they're very straight up. I really think military people are some of the best people we could go to for leadership in this issue. So it just all came together, and so now, like, I'm on the verge of saying, okay, I'll put it out there, and this is what we're doing tonight, because we can't do space migration. We can't heal humanity's deep wounds and create a beautiful new world that we know is possible, to quote Charles Eisenstein. We can't do any of this if we're under shock. The system becomes under shock. So if the system starts, you can hear the incoming shells in the 30s when things start rocking. If we have done our planning, if we've done thinking deeply about how to mitigate this, when the first big shocks come, people are going to be uncertain, in a state of panic, not knowing what the future is, but there's been enough people thinking about it and saying, we predicted this, we have the following ABC plans, we can now shift. It's not hitting us by surprise. We were not unprepared. And what Norman Hayes had said in one of our calls, he said, there is a huge difference in war between having 24 hours notice of your enemy's movements and likely attack and having no notice at all. It's a totally different thing. So if we have forewarning of in a sense, the conditions that are coming our way, we can utilize that so that it's not a question of winning this war. It's a question of, in a sense, mitigating what we brought upon ourselves through just sort of carelessness and not knowing. By the year 1970, probably there was enough CO2 emissions in the atmosphere to bring on these changes before anyone was studying it. We probably had done the damage, and thank goodness we mitigated the ozone emissions. That was a sign that we can do things. And also, as you start investing hundreds of billions of dollars in mitigation, guess what? Some of that's going to come into the CO2 emissions question. So by focusing finance and infrastructure, like we're building $1 trillion of sea level abatement around the world, some of that is going to go to reducing CO2 emissions, and much more than if we just made it a political thing. Because it's like, well, we're doing all this investment in infrastructure to bridge over. We may as well make the ride a little less rough and work on, if we get the methane plume coming off of the permafrost, we're really in trouble. And that's going to be 500 years. I mean, that's a greenhouse gas that's far more powerful than CO2. It's going to look like Blade Runner 2049. I don't know when, but that we actually have to build for that scenario. The methane release, we have to design for that scenario. Because in 500 years, we still want to have a civilization. We want to have healthcare and communications and travel and, not just lose it all in some Hollywood post-apocalyptic, depiction.
Well, I have to say, in the last month or so, I have seen a number of articles and I think even one or two books saying that there is a real risk that civilization could end. But I've only heard that really recently, and I imagine that most people don't think along those lines at all.
Yeah, and the 1990-91 was the last time where we could have ended this whole thing. If the Soviet Union had come apart, the times I was moving to Prague, the Soviet Union was coming apart. And I remember when Boris Yeltsin was standing on the tank in Red Square in front of the city hall or whatever it was, and there was chaos. And the Czechs around me, this is September 91, they would say, well, it's going to be the Prague Spring all over again. They're going to be tanks coming over the Tatra Mountains. There could be a nuclear war as the Soviet Union comes apart. And then the West would get involved and just complete chaos in the nuclear winter that Carl Sagan described. We could have done that. We did not. We put that spear down. We not set up a single nuke in what was predicted by all military planners and all intel that it was inevitable, right? They just said, there's going to be a thermonuclear exchange between country A and B and C, and there's going to be accidental thing. We haven't ever done it. That's a huge hopeful statement about the evolution of humanity, that we did not use those weapon systems and still haven't. And when everyone in the know would have said, in these circumstances, just prepare for it, so there is cause for optimism that humanity even more tightly networked together. If we stop listening to the anxiety-inducing naysayers and the fake news and all that noise, we got to cut that out, because we just can't afford that. We can't afford the distractions of that. We have to get down to work. We really have to get down to work and just block all that stuff out. That's why I don't watch the news, because it's just mostly just noise and panic and stuff like that. So it's like, no, the answer to the conspiracy theory or the fake news thing or the crazy politician is like, we just can't afford you at this point. We need to get to work. And here are the pragmatic and practical things we need to do as a civilization. Just ignore them. Just take the energy out of that system and focus on the people that are sensible and pragmatic, willing to invest and looking for the long term.
I guess that pretty much summarizes your message, Bruce. Once again, it's been a very enlightening conversation. I learned quite a few new things I was not conscious of.
Well, thank you, Jeffrey. it's always a pleasure to be on your show and to study the different suit jacket eras of Jeffrey Mishlove. And this is I can see that you're in a very 21st century shiny. I was going to wear a shiny shirt too, shiny black shirt, a very pressed, wonderful suit jacket with, of course, your personal logo type, and you've got a nice black backdrop. So this is a Mishlove 2019.
Yeah, maybe next year it'll change.
Yeah, you'll be wearing like a Vulcan. You'll be like in a
Vulcan robe. Yeah.
Well, there's a New Yorker cartoon that I loved, which was there were these. This guy was walking along, and everybody had these nice big smartphones, and he had a dumb flip phone, and he said, "Well, everyone's got smartphones, and I just have this dumb flip phone." And the next cartoon, it showed these blobs of energy, and then he's just standing there and said, "Everyone's become a pure energy being, and I'm still in this body." You know? We're always one step behind.
Well, we'll have to talk more about the energy being side of things in the future. But this has been a great excursion, Bruce. I'm really happy to be with you again. And I'm going to be, we have scheduled a time now with Annalisa.
Oh, it's so wonderful. Yeah, you'll, for all of you, the previous podcast, we did a lot of discussion on new group-based fantastic dynamics that is now coming into our society, our civilization, to help heal the inner wounds of the little children, as you will, the little inner kindergarten. And Annalisa set up one of these, if you could call it a school. It's kind of a healing plus awakening group that I've been part of for 4 years, and I've never been through anything close to this. And to my mind, it's like the most advanced spiritual technology that I've ever encountered. And Annalisa worked this out over 30 years, and we're all it's just a huge pleasure to be in this. It's almost like a return of the Jedis, These are not the droids you're looking for, kind of thing.
So I'm linking right now to our previous interview for viewers who really haven't watched it and want to get up to speed about the impact of the Luminous Awareness Institute in your life and your work. They can just click right now in the upper right-hand corner of their screen and watch it. And soon I will be releasing the interview with Annalisa herself.
And what we can, Jeffrey, plan on our next one on like the pure blob energy beings. We'll tackle that one next. It's what we all want to become.
Sooner or later. Well, Bruce, this has been a great pleasure to be with you, and we'll schedule more.
Absolutely. Let's keep it going.